AI in the current world, it's kind of scary a little bit because it's a once in a decade change. To me, the experience of working in Autodesk, I'd not be shy to say that has shaped my entire design philosophy. And that's where having an extremely strong design vision comes into place. A leader technically has to be a lot more, I would say, self-aware about where they can add value and where they need to push back.
Hi everyone, welcome to the season 1 of Behind the Screens. Today I have with me Harish Simha, who leads UX design to enhance Google support experiences. He's been a leader since the last 15 years. He's handled big design teams, large-scale design teams at Razorpay, MakeMyTrip in the past, and has built many consumer experiences there. Today's conversation with Harish is going to be very interesting as we dive deep into the mindset of how he kind of functions, how he works, how he perceives, how he views design, and how his experiences and journey has been in the past. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Harish. Harish, thanks for being here. It's great to have you here. And thank you so much for doing this and coming for this podcast.
Thanks, Rohan. Thanks for having me here. I was looking at the work that you folks are doing and it's pretty phenomenal.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So Harish, I want to quickly dive in, right? So you have a varied career, like I talked about. I talked about MakeMyTrip, I talked about Razorpay, and now at Google, right? You've been designing products and experiences for travel, for payments, and a mammoth of Google products, right? Google support functions, to be more specific. So what's that journey been like? And how have things been different across that each organization? And how was it different for you to kind of, how was the mindset different?
Got it. So let me take your audience back to a time almost to the last 15 years, right? So design to me was an accident, right? So I've started as an engineer and during my engineering, I have built products, coded themselves and then got to a space where I was fairly comfortable with technology and then building stuff up. But then I think when I actually started to design an online examination portal is when I realized that, hey, there are these audience who are going to use this portal. So now, am I doing anything about them at all? Or am I just building out of my imagination in thin air? I guess that was the point where I realized that this is a thing that folks are needing. And then when I realized that, oh, this is actually a profession, and that's kind of like a realization for me, right? So from then on, I went off to pretty much, I would say, train myself a little bit until I'd say fig my way into design by trying to almost, back in the day, you didn't have a lot of resources to actually learn from and all of that. Right? So I remember reading Smashing magazine quite a lot. And inspiring from there, or maybe just looking at code drops. I don't know if you folks could relate to that, but then that's again a portal where community of designers used to share tidbits, right? Learned from all of that and got to a point where I guess curiosity was a thing that kept me driving, continuously like trying to sort of seek new information, trying to sort of update because I had deep imposter syndrome that I'm not good enough. I don't know this. I'm just like trying to sort of pretend that I'm a designer. And in the first couple of years, I feel fortunate to have a really strong foundation with great teams around me who help me understand what design is all about, which is not just about what you see, how it sort of functions, but then the kind of thought process that goes beyond it. So in total, I feel that with that kind of safety net around me, and then with my curiosity, I got to a space where I felt fairly comfortable to make mistakes and not being judged. So that's been my journey, I guess. Even to this day, my imposter syndrome doesn't really disappear, because as you shift your perspective, it gets to a point where that kicks in. So I have to deal with it even today, but then it's part of the process. So
I didn't know about the imposter syndrome, right? If and I've heard about it quite a bit. When you look at designers, a lot of them face that, not just designers, pretty much everyone. How do you get, I know that you've not gotten over it, but how do you manage that? What makes you manage that?
right, that's an interesting question. So it's because designers in general have this sense of always pushing the thinking beyond the baseline. And I feel that we often get to a point where we operate with a lot of ambiguity, right? So there's not a lot of clarity that we have while we start to work on something. And that creates a sense of confusion in terms of, am I doing the right thing? Will this needed to be sort of thought through, or will this needed to be sort of double checked, etc., right? The other part is, design as a function itself isn't as mature as the other functions like engineering and all the others. The challenge that comes with that is, if there are established systems and if there are specific ways to do things with a very, very subjective, then I think end of the day it just gets to a point where you started to feel more confident. But none of that exists in design as of today, right? We designing 5 years back is so very different than designing today. So I feel that imposter syndrome, that's the reason it just like stays out there, and it's okay. It's a healthy feeling. You need to sort of be able to handle it by keeping yourself curious, by trying to sort of be a constant learner.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay for that.
And yeah, I agree. Like, that when you have imposter syndrome, it's not always the idea to kind of eliminate it completely. It kind of makes you more curious. But that being said, Harish, I want to go back to the times where you worked at Autodesk to build products that actually help designers. That's a different ball game altogether. In this case, you typically are not just in the present. You have to think of how will someone who's design in the future, one step ahead of your audience all the time, right? So how was that role like, and how do you build that experience for people who are designers themselves, in this case architects or design engineers or physical product designers?
To me, the experience of working in Autodesk, I'd not be shy to say that has shaped my entire design philosophy. I think I was a great stepping stone for this reason, right? Autodesk was one of those most mature design orgs that design for designers, architects, and all these creative professionals, especially in ways they can express themselves, right? Now, what it helped me is to get a sense of how deep can someone go to understand about that specific creative's intent to build products, right? Now, at Autodesk, I've helped design Fusion 360, which is one of the product that I was part of. It was a 3D CAD tool that helped industrial designers to build independent product designs and take it all the way till manufacturing. So that was one of these first web-based tools that was out there years before Figma and all these other tools came in.
Yeah.
So it was a really fun experience designing such a complicated piece of technology, which is so fluent on a website.
Yeah.
So the challenge, especially, was in the lines of, while you're thinking about these use cases, thinking ahead of what are designers expecting while they use these tools, and especially in terms of back in the day, in terms of reusability of some of these components that they start to sort of now think. It is not just about the design system or the way you express yourself, but then some of these components that can immediately now start to turn into a modular unit within the larger system. That was one key part that was there. And along with that, it was also about how do you make the design itself a lot more collaborative. One thing I've also learned is about how insanely high quality expectations do people have. and then trying to sort of really build systems that actually render at that high quality, especially with the lighting, with the kind of rig that is there around the systems. I think that was really phenomenal. So to me, largely it was about enabling creatives and these industrial designers to give tools that just let them express and be natural at it. Instead of just be feeling limited about the constraint around the tool. I was especially responsible for the commenting part of this entire experience and how this experience is kind of orchestrated for a stage of the process. So I think to me that experience itself shaped my thought process of how design is not about executing all the time, but it's about facilitating a decision and how to enable people to make decisions using your product. So I think that was my experience working with Autodesk.
No, that's actually very interesting. And one thing you talked about, and I now when I look at it here from your lens, how did it feel? When you created some collaborative features or you created a great experience at Autodesk, and now when it comes to, or at least in 2015, 2016, when you moved away and you started building products or designing products in, let's say, Sketch or XD, whatever that software was, and something that you created at Autodesk yourself is not really present over there. I'm sure it was like frustrating. Like, didn't you feel like that?
Yeah, I think back in the day, right, it was about 2015 to Sketch and Zeppelin was
Yeah.
like a really good combination, right? Now, especially in Zeppelin, because of the lack of this collaborative features in terms of sharing assets and trying to have these conversations with your developer partners, it was frustrating. But then I guess to some extent, the entire aspect of collaborative design took a little bit of time to really jump into the product design ecosystem. Whereas I think we have tried to sort of do parts of that in Autodesk.
So, Harish, we talked about your times at Autodesk, and I'm going to move to something that a lot of people are somewhere worried about, but maybe they shouldn't. And I want your ideas or opinion on that, right? So, you work at Google and you focus on a lot of AI to build better experiences for contact centers, probably, right? How do you, as a designer, see AI shaping the future of design and specifically in terms of user experiences? And what is that advice that you would give to someone who's probably scared of it or who wants to incorporate AI in their design practices?
Got it. I think this is the hot topic of the town. So I'll give you like a couple of examples of how we're thinking about AI at Google, and also we'll draw parallels with how designers can think about it, right? So just think of this analogy. Couple of years back, we used to access support using a desk phone, right? And the desk phone was having a clear function. You hit a bunch of buttons and you dial, and someone on the other side picks up, and then you execute the interaction. Whereas today, support is a lot more dynamic in nature. And how did that evolve? It's because there's access to this vast amount of data that is getting generated as the customers are interacting with Google support. Now, what this means is previously it was about a monologue between a customer's need and a physical device that's out there is not learning anything basis customers' preferences. But then in the new world, you'll have multiple channels of support that customers are reaching to, where now the systems are dynamically learning about the customer's preferences. Where did they call from? What did they do before calling? And to me, that's a dialogue that's getting started. And with AI, it is about trying to understand all of this data and trying to sort of really predict what's going to happen next. What would make the customer sentiment positive? Now, that's how AI and support has been integrated. But then now start to think about AI in general for a second. AI in the current world, it's kind of scary a little bit because it's a once in a decade change, right? The last time while this massive scale of a change happened is when iPhone was introduced, and the entire sort of definition of a form factor started to change. Right now, AI is a space where we are getting into a no interface or behind the screen, as your name suggests, is getting there. Right. So now, why is because especially using artificial intelligence, we are starting to identify patterns that are now being taught to these machines that will be far more efficient at doing repetitive and automated tasks. But does that mean that designers are going to go out of their job? I don't think so, because as designers, we are really good at figuring out the core needs and motivations of our users and creating delightful experiences, right? Now, what I mean as an example is you hit a bunch of buttons and you have your food ordered, but then there's a lot of this technology that's in place in the background that's all making it happen, right? But then with AI, you don't even have to now imagine, press those set of buttons. The food naturally appears in front of you. And again, I think I've read it somewhere that AI is going to be transformational, but then as designers, our job is going to be a lot more responsible in this new world, because now you need to be able to make decisions that are a lot more safe, because AI could turn either ways. You could make decisions that are a lot more inclusive, because AI cannot be able to predict exactly basis what context are you asking the question for. So there are all these different ways that as designers we need to think. But then our core job of being problem solvers and being facilitators for decision making wouldn't really change, right? It only gives us opportunities to move beyond the automated tasks.
Got it. And, you know, while you kind of talked about it, I was imagining Jarvis, from Iron Man. Eventually, probably the world changes on that front. But that being said, you talked about how designers are going to change the way they look at products, but not really change their jobs, right? That's
Right.
the core message. Now, at this moment, if someone wants to incorporate AI into their product, a rudimentary thought probably, how should they probably go about it?
Got it. First thing, you wouldn't necessarily implement AI because you have to implement AI,
Correct.
right? So there should be a real user need that actually can be solved better using AI. So, for example, you could solve a problem right now, let's say, by selecting a sample and trying to sort of really experiment and then find a fit to that problem. And then you start to now invest in learning more about that problem. I think that's the right stage, is where AI comes in, where you now have lots and lots of these interactions that happen between a product and, let's say, a customer. And then from across those interactions, now you'll have a ton of new things to learn about, which will then help the models, in this case, very, very simply put, the machine learning models learn with this availability of data, with this richness of data, is when it will start to become a lot more productive and it will solve real customer problems. So I would highly suggest that we should be able to think AI first and use technology, but it should be grounded in solving real customer needs, and that's where the magic happens.
Got it. So Harish, we touched upon multiple things. We touched upon, your journey. We touched upon Autodesk and life over there. AI, very, very interesting take over there. But now I'll ask you a very different question. So in large scale organizations, like you're working with Google, you worked at Razorpay, there are very embedded, they're very embedded, the teams are very embedded in nature, they're very matrixed. And along with these embedded teams come a set of unique challenges. I wanted to understand, what challenges did you face in such large organizations that you currently probably face, and how do you overcome these things?
Let me just unpeel this a little bit more, right? So when we talk about embedded teams in general, we have learned that typically when teams are organized in a certain way, their outcomes are impacted, right? Especially in an embedded org, or the other way to call it as a matrix org. The advantage that you have is there's clear sense of accountability and there's clear sense of contribution that each of the folks need to do, right? Now, what it enables especially is it enables the speed of execution, the depth of thought that goes into executing something. And also it's a lot more structured thinking at speed, right? Now, when I think about some of the challenges that I see here, especially I'll talk about design a little bit. So I was in a similar role at Razorpay where I was a horizontal design leader for the entire of Razorpay businesses. Now the challenge was, especially while you're in that specific role and then your teams are embedded deeply working with the product folks, it's set up in a way where we all are trying to push the goals naturally to meet the business outcomes. But then there's a functional, I would say, focus that this horizontal design leader brings in, which means the primary challenge is there can be chances of conflicting guidance if not done well. And that's where having a extremely strong design vision comes into place. And then I also see that a design leader in these organizations need to be capable to evangelize about their design vision and how that connects to these different product, let's say, units. And then end of the day, what specific value as a design team is delivering, right? So the other example that I could think of is this is similar in Razorpay, even in Google. We have extremely clearly articulated design OKRs that we break down so that our teams are aligned on what our success looks like. At the same time, how our success is contributing to the larger org success. Now, especially when you have these aligned OKRs, it kind of sets you up for doing the right things with the intent at the same time with the kind of overall impact that you end up delivering. So that's one big piece I feel.
Correct.
And the other part is obviously because of this sort of entire sort of complexity in reporting structures, a leader technically has to be a lot more, I would say, self-aware about where they can add value and where they need to push back. If that's not something that is apparently evident, what happens is there might be a chance of a leader being too close to the team, which might just overwhelm them. At the same time, not be very productive, right? And the last thing that I'd say is, especially in matrix orgs, is very important to have the cross-pollination of insights, especially when you think about.
Can you just help me with cross pollination of insights? What does that?
Right. So when we think about what's an insight, right? It's the smallest possible fundamental truth that we know. And these insights have a specific shelf life, right? The shelf life of an insight is extremely small. So you need to be able to make those insights simple, transmissible, and have them cross-pollinated across. What I mean by that is have them easily shareable across the entire org so that all the products and all the designers and product managers and engineering managers and all the leaders and folks on the ground has an understanding about what did we learn, how we are going to implement it. It's almost like establishing a vocabulary for an org.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have to be like a huge report that someone will read for years. It could be a simple snackable format that can just like get across a bunch of slides, maybe an evening that you can spend with your partners and just help them understand what did you learn this week, last week, whatever. I think to me, trying to have that level playing ground, bringing your cross-functional partners to the level of understanding that you have about insights really creates a healthy environment for folks to make user-centric decisions, right? So we often talk about making user-centric experiences, but these are the things that I think really elevate and bring it to life.
Yeah. So when you're talking about, and it's very interesting thought I just had, right? If let's say I'm a younger designer and, when you talked about how you could, in some way, how your insights are somewhere documented when you talk about cross-pollination, that everyone has access to it in some way or the other. Or do you think it's a must-have?
I'd say as a designer, right, I fundamentally believe that you are a facilitator for decisions in an org, right? You have a superpower to help people visualize. Your superpower is to transmit information that is easily digestible about your users. You often use the word user advocate. What I mean by that is you need to be able to know what business you are in. You need to be able to know exact specifics about who you're designing for, what's motivating them, and what context are they using your product in. And now imagine if you are a fanatic about that information and if you keep sharing that information with your partners, is when naturally, even if you're an entry level designer, you would have value at the table because you have an edge with the information that you know that others don't know, that will now help enable decision making, which actually I think is the superpower that any designer would be highly valued for.
Yeah. I think that's something that probably somewhere I believe all these insights, if there was a document across an organization, where a designer could just write all that they know, it would just make decisions for sales teams or product teams so much easier because they kind of understand and they are the ones who are solving a lot for a user and understanding the behaviors. But thanks for that, Harish. So coming to something at Pineapple that we're a lot into is research, UX research. And I'm sure that you interviewed so many users in your past. Are there any memorable research projects or any instances or any insights that you remember and really led to significant product improvements?
So a fantastic team at Google right now. We are enabling support experience to be a lot more seamless and connective in general. So where we started is support in the past was more like I shared was about almost like this monologue where the systems aren't learning anything about your preferences, right? Especially with the surge of AI and the kind of now new technology that is available, we've started to really identify opportunities that can like really shift the lens of how we deliver support. And as an example, while we started to sort of think about how we can learn how the customers started to interact with us, all the way, let's say, learning about what did they even do before they raised a support ticket. So at Google, I think it's been interesting to sort of in general look at these different shifts.
So Harish, I'm going to go now to travel. Okay, your travel experience at MakeMyTrip, right? Over there, I believe you handled the overall experience strategy and design strategy for accommodations and transport verticals. Did you create any projects or work on any projects that actually won awards or a lot of appreciation internally, externally, whatever that may be?
So it was back in 2015 that I worked for a couple of years at MakeMyTrip, Rohan's. So back in that day, buying books online was a thing, but buying accommodations online was not as usual, right? So there were days where some of us might remember walking up to a vacation and then early in the morning after you get down from the bus or wherever, you now end up looking at a bunch of hotels yourself and figure out physically, feel what you are going to sort of actually experience for the next couple of days and then book. You have that flexibility before and you prefer that that's a way in which transaction works. But then when you actually shift that paradigm and now bring it online, the experiential part wouldn't go away, right? Because you as a human is core motivation is to enjoy the stay. The project that I remember fondly is what we internally called as Matchmaker. There's a phenomenal cross-functional team and designers who has focused on this one. In that specific project, it was about enabling travel even while your intent is not as strong, because most of the folks prefer traveling when they feel burned out or for various reasons that might not be very, very specifically having that high motivation. But then you might end up, where do I even go? And in this process of figuring out where do you even go, you end up missing the bus and your long weekend is gone, right? So we've tried to solve that problem where we enabled Matchmaker to help you understand about the city, different parts of the city, and trying to enable you to feel like a local on how and where do locals spend most time, what kind of spaces do they explore, where do you find great food, now not backed by MakeMyTrip but backed by all these other external sources that are more trustworthy. So bringing an integrated experience into the app, and now once you share your preferences with us, we'll now end up showing you a list of properties, very limited, selective, sorted by the match that it made to your preferences, right? Now, what happens is, end of the day, you now start to get recommendations that are extremely tailored to your needs. At the same time, also lets you experience the city in a lot more local fashion. So that's one project that I could think of when you ask this question.
Yeah. That's like, this is like saying that a Tinder of experiences or the Tinder of,
Right.
matchmaking. But yeah, that's interesting. So, Harish, I'm going to go to a couple of questions that I wanted to ask about leadership, and, that will be beneficial to people who are just entering or who have limited experience at this point in the design field, right? So, one question it starts is that, if you were, right now you're a leader, you understand how leadership works in a certain way. If you knew what leadership was in the earlier stages of your life, let's say when you were just 2 years, 3 years of experience, what would you have done differently then?
Takes me back. I think it's an interesting question. So, to me, it's a couple of things. So, first thing is product sense itself, right? So, when I say product sense, it's your ability to understand what motivates folks to make a specific decision while using a product, right? Now, product sense as an ability and your ability to think in terms of what your experience is going to translate, maybe moving a business outcome or whatever. I think just trying to have that larger understanding beyond the experience, beyond the interface, really helps you be a great designer. So to me, that's one thing that clearly comes to mind. The other thing that I could think of is I think we often underestimate as designers the value that we need to communicate to our partners about where design can actually make a difference. So while you talk about design, we can complicate the hell out of it, right? And we can say a bunch of things that this is what I do.
Yeah.
We can use jargon and stuff like that. But then end of the day, the simplest of the ideas move faster. The simplest of the thoughts transmit faster. So I feel that that's one of the aspects that most designers need to work on. I've worked on myself as well to simplify your communication of value of design. And lastly, I could think of just the ability to have deep connections and gratitude to your cross-functional partners in being with you, along with you to build the entire sort of products that you're ending up building. I think most of us feel that there's this sense of emotional bank balance. You know what I mean? It's almost like when you talk to someone, when you have those trusted conversations, you establish that balance in the other person so that the next time when you go to them, they kind of either you can withdraw from it or you can deposit new balance. So what it means is you now need to be able to judge your currency on how much emotional bank balance you have with your cross-functional partners. This is, I guess, the most impactful learning that I had in my career that enabled me to be a better designer and also a leader.
I think it's the first time, someone's put this in a way that's how it assesses emotional how you put emotional bank balance into it. I've never seen a take on this, but I love that. But that being said, Harish, a question around that comes to me is that you've hired many people, you led teams, you know what is good about designers, what is bad, what is a must have. So are there any, when you hire someone, are there any particular skills or attributes that you look for in them? And what is that one thing that makes you feel like, this is a must have in someone who I want in my team?
Got it. So I'll share my opinion. Doesn't necessarily represent Google's here. So I feel one of the most crucial skills that I look for is self-awareness. Right? How well do you know yourself? I think that just goes a long way. It just boils down into many other things that I'll now talk a little bit about. The other part is vulnerability, like how I would say how open you are for healthy criticism. And someone who thinks that they are part of a larger system and have that people first mentality where it's all about the team all the time. And I think having this combination worked extremely well from a culture point of view. And from a craft point of view, I feel that the extreme sort of care and inclusion that someone puts into, let's say, crafting a design, either getting the last level pixel details up or getting the right insights to solve a meaningful problem. I think having that care and that intentionality is extremely important, for me at least. And the other part is, while you look at that piece of the craft, it's also important on how you communicate the value of that to a cross-functional partner. I've told you about that, right? I think if you do great stuff and you're not able to communicate, that doesn't work. So especially someone who can clearly articulate the thought process in simple words, visuals to the other person so that the message is passed is the other craft skill that I typically look at. But yeah, I mean, a combination of these cultural skills and these craft skills really bring in a lot of this diverse group of skills to the table, which kind of makes the design process a lot more interesting and fun.
Yeah, no, I understand where you come from, but one of the things that I relate to the most in this is, how good you are at your communication to everyone else and not just your team. Because as someone who's a founder of Pineapple, I've typically seen team members being able to communicate internally, because you have that freedom, I know what I'm going to talk to my team. But sometimes when it comes to stakeholders, you sort of can't work around it. But that brings me to another question, Harish, that, if, you've mentored people in your past, you've talked to them. I've seen you kind of do that previously. But when you mentor them, what is that advice? What is that, what is that thought that you give them that really helps them build their skills or really helps them understand?
What's the first piece of advice that you give whenever someone new joins your team?
Thanks, Srishti.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I think, again, there are lots of things, but then what comes to mind right now is I'll ask them to soak themselves as a sponge into the product context. That's the first thing that I say anyone. Especially the reason why I feel that's important is, as designers, like I told, we are enabling decisions to happen. So you wouldn't necessarily enable decisions without knowing as much about your industry, right? So I think knowing about your business, knowing about how you're making money, knowing about why your customers are using your product and what unique value are you delivering to your customers, you'd not be a good designer, right? And the other part that I also think of is how you're going to translate the influence with your team, right? And especially when you say influence, as a new designer, it's often important for you to understand how you're going to design, which is just the first part of the equation. But then you end up spending the rest of the half or even more than the half just to communicate how your design works, how it plugs into the larger system, how your developer partners now need to develop it, how you need to measure that design, and how that design now performs out live, and whether you kill it or you run it, right? To me, having that end-to-end understanding of a designer is important. And also having that intentionality of persisting until your design is live and seeing how it performs just makes someone very different, right? And having that skill, I guess, is really important.
I completely relate to many different things here. But I mean, I'll just move forward to one other dying question that I have. Okay. And this is on a lighter note. We're going to move away from design a little bit. So, what I learned is that you had taken a personal sabbatical and, you kind of explored permaculture. You had an organic farm near Bangalore. Why farming? What was that? Like, is that Harish as a person? Like, what's that?
So this actually goes a little deeper than my usual professional self. I guess after a couple of years into designing, I got to a point where I started to really understand what it means to be, let's say, 50-year profession or a 20-year profession, right? When I started to actually question, do I really wanted to be in design for the next 20, 25 years? I was like, I'm not sure. Then what would be sustainable, yet interesting, yet keeps me like curious, learning more? To me, it felt food production, especially organic food production, is something that is not going to die. That's not going to sort of stop evolving. So to me, that's a field that I felt particularly fascinated about. And also, there's a lot that I can learn from something that I don't know anything of. So it was a passion that was always there. The other part to that question is, why farming only? To me, farming is one of those areas that I feel hasn't been disrupted by technology as much as it should be. So I feel that me being closer to farming and me being having the experience of technology, using that into farming kind of has an opportunity for me sometime down. I'm not sure. But then I think it just grounds me. It just gets me back to the roots of what it matters end of the day. And all of this is sham and glam, right? So, but I just feel that I need a reason for existence, and to me that was farming that was kind of helping me like slow down.
Harish, you talked about, farming as probably one of the things that you would want to explore in the future. But I want to just bring those learnings that you currently have in organic farming to the present. And I want to ask you that, do you draw any inspiration from your organic farming journey to your design journey?
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very interesting question. And so I practice a specific technique called permaculture. So permaculture is about permanent agriculture. So it's building sustainable forests within urban spaces. Now, what that means is there's systems right in the name, which is how do you think about these interdependent systems that work on each other, yet make the system as a whole stand up. So, as an example, if you have a chicken coop that is closer to your vegetable garden, the chickens will take care of the vegetable garden, keeping it clean and all of that. At the same time, they put the manure there to make the garden a lot more effective. That's a simple example of how there can be an interdependable system that can create. But then that's one example. Right? The other thing that I can think of is the shelf life of decisions that we have in farming and in design is extremely small. So you need to be extremely careful. You need to be open and willing to make mistakes. At the same time, also you have a room for experimentation, right? So that's the other clear parallel that I could think of. And lastly, I think farming has got to do not just with farming itself, but then it has also got to do with how do you now start to share with others? How do you now start to build a sustainable ecosystem around your farm, which is not about, okay, you produce and you sell, you make money and you get home, versus you produce, you sell, you keep whatever you want, you share the additional surplus, which actually creates a circular economy, which means end of the day, you are producing something that actually gets back to people who are in need, especially in design. If you look at that, every decision that you're making, especially in physical product design, I could think of, needs to be sustainable because you're already in a world where we are surplus of more than what we need. So I think every design, I feel also physical or from a digital point of view, needs to be sustainable in nature and help people adapt over time. And these are the kind of parallels that I could think of from a farm and digital product design, physical product design.
I love the aspect of how making design sustainable in nature, although it's a little more challenging when it comes to digital products. And I understand why you give the physical product example, but that's something we're also trying to think of. We often work with more sustainable companies, like climate tech companies, who are more conscious about what we're contributing through digital designs into the world. But that's a separate conversation. That being said, Harish, I have a couple of questions, and I'm just going to end our session with these short, quick answers. You can answer it in one word, you can answer it in a line, however you feel, but it needs to come instantaneously from you, right?
Sounds good. I'll try my best.
Yeah, best of luck. But what do you feel is the most important trait that you've acquired throughout these years?
Empathy.
Empathy. And I'll give you an example. There is a brilliant individual contributor who has very little ability to manage a team, but is a brilliant contributor. Then there is a brilliant team leader with very little experience as an individual contributor. If you had to pick someone in your team, who would you choose and why?
It purely depends on the context and the need of the hour for that specific team at that moment. Imagine if I have to make a decision at that moment, I'd probably go with someone who is a great manager and not a so-called great designer at the same time, just for a simple reason. Management has got nothing to do with being a good designer. You should be a good person at the heart. You need to know how to make teams happy, how to keep them productive, how to keep them clear in their heads. And if someone is doing that, I feel I'll invest in them versus, let's say, again, it's not either or, like I told.
Yeah.
So it depends on the context of the hiring. But I feel that if a great manager with the self-awareness of being in their I'd say at the core, a great person, I can surely bet on them.
All right. I have a slightly conflicting thought, but I'll share that later on. What is your biggest failure in design or UX design? And what did you learn from that?
I would probably talk about how I've underestimated the value of knowing the product context early in my life. And I'm exactly opposite today. I feel, at least I'll try to be. I think as a designer, it's very easy for us to just being boxed into the pixels and not thinking anything beyond it. And I don't want to take reasons and say, here's why. But then I feel that that's one area I wish I could have done a lot more better in terms of understanding the context and helping people understand the context, which I think is definitely helpful today. So maybe I think I'll go back and correct that if I have to.
Oh yeah, I mean I think that's something that you gave as an advice for people as well, and I get where it comes from now.
Yes.
But all right. So another question is, what have you read or seen very recently that has inspired you?
Oh, I am a huge fan of podcasts. Oh, during my runs, I love hearing podcasts. On my drives, I hear podcasts. And then I also kind of read quite a lot on my iPad.
I read podcast coming. It's called Behind the Screen.
Sure. Sure. Definitely, folks. I think the podcast that I heard most recently and I felt very inspired are the podcasts by Intercom. I think they are fantastic. The way they talk about craft, the way they talk about industry, I guess is pretty phenomenal. At the same time, I am a huge fan of Knowledge Project by Shane. I guess that's, again, is a wealth of data that just comes by. And lastly, I also sort of keep hearing a bunch of podcasts, especially in the area of leadership, especially HBR has some really good ones out there. So those are my picks for podcasts. And in terms of books, the recent kind of book I've read, and it's not as new as such, but then it's called Moments, where you talk about specific moments that can be carefully planned and organized that could have been happened just like that, which means in the past there were moments where you could have choreographed and made them happen in a certain way, which would have improved the experience quotient much, much higher, but then you didn't. It's because you didn't realize it was a moment that could have been phenomenal, right? So to me, that was a really, like, I'd say, a light bulb moment, because end of the day, all we do as designers is we connect moment after moment that matters to our customers, right? So it's about that. So that was the most recent inspiration I felt, or like aha moment.
Thanks for summarizing that book for me. I think I have a couple of things to reflect myself. All right, the last question for today, and this one needs to come from your heart. Okay.
Yep.
What does product design mean to you?
Look, I think product design has been evolving for the past whatsoever years that it has been out there. So let me take a couple of examples in the past. To me, product design is about a few things done really, really well, which is at the foundational level, it is about understanding what makes this product usable, which is helping people use the product, and then what makes this product sellable, which is helping people understand how can I make this product valuable to others, right? To me, end of the day, it's just about both of them. Take the case of Charles and Ray Eames, couple of decades past, where they built houses, they sold furniture to Dieter Rams, to the designers that we have today for building phenomenal experiences. All of them focused on these two key things. And to me, product design is about understanding both sides of this coin. And that's what make a difference, especially while designers of today think about what should I do next. You should just learn at the foundations these two things. How do you build something that's valuable? How do you sell something that you've produced of value?
I think I think a lot of designers don't understand. They understand probably building, but they don't understand selling, and they aren't able to storytell on that front. But that wraps up for today. I mean, thank you so much for joining us, Harish. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And I believe this is gonna really help someone somewhere, just really get them inspired to do or motivate them to do something better.
Thanks, Rohan and Dishti, for having me. I guess this was a great chat. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversations and the depth of topics that you've had for me to talk. And I'm also happy to sort of have your audience reach out to me on Twitter and LinkedIn, so that they can get the guidance that they're expecting. And I'll be available to sort of help aspiring designers, because of course we're a small industry and we need to be able to have that more open, more connected, and I'm willing to help out. So feel free to reach out.
Lovely. We'll put all those credentials when we release the video.
Sounds good.
But thanks so much. Great speaking with you, Harish.
Thanks, Rohan.